Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lah. Wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh. Amma ba'du fa'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. The topic of my presentation today is Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad, a global peacemaker. This stage, this platform, this occasion is a handwork of a prophet of Allah, a prophet of God sent for the guidance of humankind to the very purpose of our creation, the cognizance of our Creator and our Sustainer, and to build a lasting relationship with Him. The promised Messiah, Hazrat Mirza Ahmad of Qadian, the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, was commissioned by God Almighty for this very purpose, to solve the problems of the latter days and to be the torchbearer, leading us to salvation. It is the way of Allah that whenever we get distracted from this very purpose of our creation and we begin to get on the brink closer to destruction because of our own handiwork, He guides us back onto that path. And the way of doing that is by selecting someone from amongst us to guide us back to that purpose. And about that, Allah Almighty Himself says that you will never find a change in the way of Allah. Chapter 33, verse 63. I say without a shadow of doubt in my mind that looking at the recent history of the world and looking at the current state of affairs, we can all unanimously agree that we are on the brink of a global disaster of catastrophic proportions, that we should be concerned for ourselves and for the generations to come. The political structure of most, if not all, countries of the world is such that people are compelled to choose between very limited choices, majority of which they don't necessarily agree with. The metrics with which we measure the competency of our leaders is not based on moral qualities. Most aspirants of authority are motivated by personal interests and their levels of loyalty to their political parties. We end up entrusting power to those that are the elite amongst us, the famous, the popular. And then we are left with outcomes, with the results that we see around the world. And if we were to go on an imaginary tour of the entire continent of Africa and the Middle East, we will see the havoc, the hunger and the chaos that's caused by warfare, the political instability in Europe, racial injustice in the United States and other countries around it, the corruption and poverty in South America and Asia. But this could easily turn into a speech of a pessimist or the boring report of a news anchor to an audience that's well acquainted with the current state of affairs. The question I therefore put to you is, which individual do you know? Which organization, which group that genuinely cares about these things that the world is going through and is willing to do something about it? Just think about it, any individual that you know. The problems certainly cannot be ignored, nor can their coverage in the news suffice. Something has to be done about it. As communal beings, we must agree to live by certain principles that are balanced enough to take care of everyone, or at least the majority of people. We agree on this in principle and in theory. It's very easy to say it, but most have almost lost hope in the reality of this, in the practicality of this reality. We know that we desperately need solutions, and we need them now because of the state of affairs. The solution that's being presented by the Ahmadiyya Muslim community is in the form of a leadership that does not promise riches and enjoyment of materialistic gains in any way. Leadership that is not desired and sought after through campaigns and unrealistic promises. leadership by example, demanding the highest levels of accountability from the most powerful to the lowest in the hierarchy. It is the divine institution of Khilafat. This ideal leadership, one may think, it's almost unrealistic, will only become reality when we look at it through the lenses of Khilafat in Ahmadiyyat. Ahmadiyyat Khilafat is based on a proven model, not on shallow theories. With the utterance of the word Khilafat, Khalifa, Caliphate, a lot of hearts would tremble out of fear, understandably so. But before we reach any conclusions, give me an opportunity to speak to your hearts and lend me your ears for a few moments to look at the true meaning of this word, Khilafat, through the lenses of Islam Ahmadiyyat. Leading a community currently established in over 200 nations and territories around the world, the present Khalifa, the worldwide spiritual and administrative head of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, His Holiness Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad, practically guides tens of millions across the globe. Following a 133 years clean track record, His Holiness leads the community facing persecution and oppression, an organizational state, by states and by individuals. And having gone through multiple stages of this oppression, the persecution reached new bounds in 2010 when armed extremists stormed 2 Ahmadi Muslim mosques in Lahore in Pakistan, opening fire at worshippers within the sacred walls of a mosque, killing nearly 100 people. In a fascinating manner, loved ones of these martyrs were counseled to practice nonviolence, patience, and prayerful. Thoughts and prayers may sound like a joke to people who face atrocities, but when it comes from the Khalifa, His Holiness, to the tens of millions of Ahmadi Muslims around the world, these words are enough to heal their hearts, and it gives tranquility to their souls. It is indeed such responses by the Khalifa that have given him the title, a man of peace. And this is the true reflection of the Quranic injunction of seek help with patience and prayer. Surely Allah is with the steadfast. Even when rumors suggested that Ahmadi Muslims were on the brink of retaliating against these oppressors, His Holiness took to the stage and he addressed those Muslims who could have been easily influenced by these rumors. And he says, and I quote, "This is a view of ignorance, the concept of retaliating against our oppressors. It's a view of ignorance. Such members have forgotten our fundamental teachings and principles. The promised Messiah, peace be upon him, taught us to bear tyranny and persecution with patience. The progress and victory destined for the promised Messiah, peace be upon him, is to be attained by turning to righteousness, to love, to affection and prayers." End quote. History shows that anyone that has been selected in this position of being the Khalifa of the Ahmadi Muslim community consistently sacrifices everything they've ever worked for. They're ready to be rejected, to be persecuted, to be defamed, yet they will never betray any of those values that have been instilled in them, nor would they abandon any of those responsibilities put on their shoulders. The Khalifa stands upright, resolute, and determined, exhibiting at all times truthfulness without disguise, virtue without arrogance, patience without protest, and humility without pretense. Before being elevated to the station of the Khalifa, His Holiness Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad lived a very simple life, a life of secrecy, meeting his Lord in privacy, gaining that pleasure by praying to his Lord in private. But a time comes when such people are selected by God to illuminate the world with the light that has touched them from within. Upon completing his master's degree in agricultural economics in Pakistan, His Holiness devoted his entire life to the service of humanity and to gain the pleasure of his Creator. He was sent by the then Khalifa to Ghana, West Africa, where he engaged in social, educational, and agricultural development projects. He was accredited with successfully growing wheat on Ghanaian soil, the first time in the nation's history, coming from the Gambia myself, the smallest country in mainland Africa. My people were used to foreigners coming in and taken away from us in the form of slavery, in the form of colonization or modern-day economic slavery. But through the practical example of His Holiness and through his instructions, thousands of professionals across different fields of work sacrificed their lives and dedicated to the service of humankind, following his practical example. My good friend, who was born and raised in Washington, D.C., after completing his education, dedicated his life to the service of humanity. And upon the instructions of the Khalifa, he relocated to the Gambia in a small village from the comforts of Washington with his family to serve as a school teacher. Another friend of mine who was born and raised in the Midwest completed his studies as a medical student. And immediately after his residency, he devoted his life for that same cause, the service of humanity. And upon the instructions of the Khalifa, he relocated to Pakistan, a country in which Ahmadi Muslims have not known peace for decades, in a country where his brethren are butchered, maimed, and unjustly imprisoned merely because of their faith. But these soldiers of the Khalifa understand their responsibility to serve, not to receive any equivalent or any better favor in return, not for accolades and credits, but to serve in the spirit of the Holy Quran as a mother would serve her own child. In 2004, His Holiness launched the annual National Peace Symposium in the UK, in which guests from all walks of life come together to exchange ideas on the promotion of peace and harmony. Each year, the convention attracts many serving ministers, parliamentarians, politicians, religious leaders, and other dignitaries. In 2009, His Holiness launched the annual Ahmadiyya Muslim Prize for the Advancement of Peace, and in a National Peace Award for individuals or organizations that have demonstrated an extraordinary commitment and service to the cause of peace and humanitarianism. His Holiness is guiding the International Association of Ahmadi Architects and Engineers to clean up after the destruction of wars and poverty across the world, building model villages, providing electricity and clean water to those people that need it, training the locals to take care of and maintain those facilities. It was from the United Kingdom that Humanity First was launched, an international charity organization that has received UN recognition status for the worldwide disaster relief action and its work in the service of needs of mankind, irrespective of color or creed. Through the leadership of His Holiness and his continuous guidance, Humanity First keeps climbing higher heights. They've built schools in their hundreds across the globe, and with the help of the Ahmadi Muslim community, provided teachers to those schools that need them. They've built hospitals in different parts of the world and provided doctors and medical staff to the needy nations of the world, vocational and skill centers to help young people and equip them with skills to save them from crime and to better their lives and those of their loved ones and their nations. But yet, the humility of this man of God, this Khalifa, is such that he doesn't see any of these as a favor to anybody. Upon the invitation of the Premier of Ontario, Canada, His Holiness explained to that audience that the true spirit of sacrifice is a requirement for us to get a peaceful society. It's a requirement. And he says, I quote, "It should not be that you help the poor and the needy only out of your extra resources you have, but rather you should be willing to inflict hardship on yourself in an effort to help your brothers and sisters and to fulfill their rights," end quote. This is a practical display of the motto and the slogan of the Ahmadi Muslim community: love for all, hatred for none. This is service motivated by love. It's not politics. The same love that has been infiltrated into the community of the Khalifa. Hence, the Khalifa surrounds himself with men, women, and children across the globe from all walks of life, whose advice he seeks. whose counsel he seeks, and they advise him based on their sincerity and, most importantly, their fervent prayers. In 2012, His Holiness wrote a series of letters to world leaders, and he went on a tour of Europe and America, meeting leaders and dignitaries. He has traveled the length and breadth of Africa, meeting presidents of different nations. The Japanese dignitaries appreciated the kind words of the Khalifa when he visited Japan, and he reminded them of their responsibilities, of their contributions toward global peace. He has traveled and given keynote addresses at the New Zealand National Parliament, the European Parliament, the United Kingdom House of Commons, and of course, the Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. His advocacy for global peace is enshrined in a special bipartisan U.S. congressional resolution in recognition of and honor of His Holiness. And the introductory paragraph of that reads, welcoming His Holiness, Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad, the worldwide spiritual and global head and the administrative head of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, to Washington, D.C., and recognizing his commitment to world peace, justice, nonviolence, human rights, religious freedom, and democracy. The travels of His Holiness are not for any diplomatic ties. They're not to negotiate deals and contracts. They're not for the sales of weapons, as some leaders would do. They're not for the destruction of lives, becoming allies with one side of a conflict and opposing the other. That's not what he does. On the contrary, consistently, wherever he goes, His Holiness calls towards peace and reconciliation. Leaders seek advice and prayers from him. He admonishes leaders to stop arms trades, making money off of the blood of others. The powerful nations are reminded by His Holiness of their responsibilities to protect the weaker nations. To our President Barack Obama in 2012, His Holiness writes, the major powers of the world, such as the United States, should play their part, should play their roles in establishing world peace. They should not use the acts of smaller nations as a pretext to disturb world harmony. In his letter to the President of Iran, he acknowledged the double standards of the West, which have caused restlessness and disorder around the world. And he also highlighted the inappropriate behavior of some Muslim groups who torture other people in the name of a peaceful religion, such as Islam, which are against the teachings of Islam and the Holy Quran. In light of the spirit of the Quranic teachings, His Holiness reminded the President of Iran that the enmity of a nation must never let Muslims act any way other than contrary to the principles of justice. He reminded the Premier of China as a leader of a nation with great superpower, and he reminded him of his power to veto when required at the United Nations. He urged him to, quote, play a role to save the world from the destruction that looms before us, irrespective of nationality, religion, caste, or creed. We must strive to our utmost to save humanity. His Holiness has been at the forefront of the fight against extremism and oppression. When so-called Muslims hurt other people that disagree with them in the name of Islam, it becomes the responsibility of every Muslim, especially Muslim leaders, to disassociate themselves from such actions and to teach the world the real teachings of the Holy Quran. In this same spirit, His Holiness invited the King of Saudi Arabia to this very crucial cause, that irrespective of the doctrinal differences between the Ahmadiyya Muslim community and other sects of Islam, we should come together to establish, in an effort to establish world peace. He writes to the king, and I quote, the conflict between Palestine and Israel is worsening every day, and hostilities between Iran and Israel have heightened to such an extent that their relationship has severely broken down. Such circumstances require that as an extremely important leader in the Muslim Ummah, you should make every effort to resolve these disputes with justice and equality. After acknowledging the efforts of the leaders of our great nation in his Capitol Hill keynote address, His Holiness reminded us that human intellect and knowledge are very limited. And it's possible that when we are formulating policies, certain factors can enter the human minds that cloud our judgment, and certain decisions can be made that are selfish. That's just being human. But then he says, God's law, however, is perfect, and so no vested interests or unfair provisions exist. This is because God only desires for the good and betterment of His creation, and therefore His law is based entirely in justice. The day the people of the world come to recognize and understand this crucial point will be the day the foundation for true and everlasting justice will be laid. In devastating situations like the war between Russia and Ukraine, the advice of His Holiness in his 2012 address at the European Parliament is pertinent if only they listened. He says to them, always remember that peace can only be established by helping both the oppressed and the oppressor in a manner that is completely impartial, free from vested interests, and devoid of all enmity. Peace is made by giving all parties an equal platform and playing field, end quote. Indeed, this conflict of Russia and Ukraine has gone beyond the borders of two neighboring countries. But perhaps the most disturbing thing as highlighted by His Holiness when a small Norwegian child asked him was the possibility of this turning into a world war. His Holiness has warned the presidents of both countries to try to negotiate and not to start a war. And after the war began, His Holiness instead of urging countries to take sides, instead of encouraging countries to provide weapons, instead of encouraging countries to stake one side of the conflict and oppose the other, His Holiness continued to call for every effort to be made to de-escalate the situation before it erupts beyond all control. He says, describing the situation, that a dark and ominous shadow has been cast upon much of the world. And if, God forbid, the current situation escalates further, the consequences do not bear thinking about. This is similar to what he said to world powers during the Syria crisis in 2014, when His Holiness said that it's the duty of all powers to fulfill the requirements of justice and to unite together. All parties need to increase dialogue and open the lines of communication so that they can peacefully discuss the best means to solve the problems of the world. For 10 years, His Holiness has been ringing the alarm bells that the world, as a result of failure to abide by justice at both national and international levels, is slowly leading towards World War III. He's consistently been calling towards practical steps, such as recognizing our Creator, establishing absolute justice, fostering global unity, seeking nuclear disarmament, eliminating weapon profiteering, creating economic equity, and eliminating poverty, working for the good of one's nation, rejecting all forms of extremism, and instilling service to humanity. And when the world was shut down, there was confusion and chaos, and we needed exemplary leadership to navigate the ship through the storms of the COVID pandemic. The Khalifa once again stepped up proactively, and he warned us about this pandemic, that after seeing what has occurred according to the decree of God Almighty, and as a grave warning to mankind to reform and forego all forms of injustice and cruelty, he wrote letters to the leaders of 14 countries across Africa, Asia, America, Europe, and to the General Secretary of the United Nations and the Pope. He concurred with the sentiments of the Pope, who also said that due to the natural disasters that are happening rapidly, it's a response and reaction to the wrongs and negligence of today's world. And the promised Messiah said something to that same effect when he reminded us that these natural disasters or calamities that occur, or through which the nations of the past were destroyed, were not merely due to their disbelief. Rather, they were ruined as a result of their arrogance, of their transgression and cruelties. Even the Pharaoh did not perish due to his disbelief, rather due to the injustices and brutalities perpetrated. In addition to the health concerns of the coronavirus, His Holiness drew the attention of the world to the economic impacts of the COVID. He warned that once the more powerful nations felt that their economies were being destroyed, it's very possible that they will begin to attack the smaller countries' economies and their wealth. And based on one excuse or the other, they will usurp their wealth and they will build blocks, due to which a Cold War is likely to reemerge. He drew the attention of the UN Secretary General and reminded him of his role, not to be intimidated. He says, quote, "Use your platform to bring unity amongst nations, in which each country is treated equally and without prejudice, rather than bowing to the might and will of a select number of dominant world powers." Even when the world seems to ignore the calls of this humble man of God, he continues to fulfill his responsibilities. And I can assure you, there'll never come a time when His Holiness will cease to continue his mission. When the foresight of a parent senses danger in the path of a child, the soul of that parent becomes restless as long as the child does not take heed. The love that His Holiness has for all people of the world knows no bounds. He has the moral authority, the spiritual insight, and he stands on that neutral platform from which people all over the world respect his approach and his efforts. And as we leave this august gathering, we should remember that there is a silent voice praying for the world, a stern leader continuously reminding his followers and people of all faiths around the world and no faith of their individual and collective efforts and responsibilities to bring about peace in the world. And that recognition of our Creator is what will ultimately bring about that justice which will inevitably lead to peace we all yearn. May Allah Almighty continue to strengthen our Khalifa with the spirit of holiness and grant him the ability to keep leading us towards better days. Wa akhiru dawana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.